Good evening, everyone. Tonight is a planning board work session. The date is Tuesday, January 14th, 2025. The time is 6:33. We will do roll call. Susan Axelrod. Here. Joe Murphy is absent. Robin Pothier. Here. Liz Karp. Here. Caper Wilson. Here. Peter DiStefano is absent, and Maria Mack is here. Our first agenda item under land use is Old Tower Hill Road Neighborhood Study follow-up on the December presentation from Able City East. Jamie.
So under this agenda heading, just a couple of items. I know you met with Jason King in November. From my understanding, and I did listen to the meeting, that it was a productive meeting, and there was a lot of information. I think Jason had in excess of 100 slides that he went through. We have sent that to everyone. I don't know if there's any specific questions that anyone has on his presentation, but where we are on the project is we internally have a draft 200-plus page document from Jason, which includes a explanation of the process, a summary of the charrettes, and a draft regulatory document associated with a form-based code type of development regulation. He has the area broken into, I think it's 4 transects, and I don't know if I know he mentioned that to everyone, but transect is just another terminology for a zone. So there's a residential zone in the area, and then there's 2 commercial, 3 hierarchies to the commercial zone. There's a gateway zone, kind of a commercial neighborhood, and then a density neighborhood between gateway and neighborhood transition. So again, we're reviewing those internally. We'll have conversations with Jason. Any revisions that we need to have accomplished internally will be undertaken, and then we'll release the document to the planning board and anyone who would like it, and put it on our webpage as a draft document. So we're probably about 2 weeks away from that. Again, I'm going through it with a very conservative view, because it is not just a document that's intended to go on the shelf. It has that regulatory component to it. So I'm trying to put a developer's hat on with the understanding of here's a regulation. How would I utilize it as an applicant, and how will I potentially ask my attorney to read the words, look at the graphics, and do something different than what everyone is intended as a product to result. So we're trying to find any potential loopholes on the onset of looking at that regulatory guide. And again, as the conversation continues, we're looking at providing this regulatory guideline, whether it's in the final stage for adoption or needs to be modified slightly, will be a robust conversation both with the planning board before you make any recommendations to council on changes to the regulations. I think one of the primary things is there's really 2 components to the form-based code. The form-based code lays out kind of density in your structural box, what building bulk and density looks like. And when I talk about bulk and density, how much space a building can occupy on a lot, where the building should be located or is required to be located on a lot, how tall it can be, what type of shape it can be. Anything over 4 stories can have a flat roof, but anything under 4 stories has to have some sort of gable type pitched roof. There are discussions there. That defines kind of the shoebox and where the shoebox and how big the shoebox is on a lot. But it doesn't tell you what the architectural aspects of that shoebox are. And I think everybody has a vision based on what they showed you as a result of the charrette of what an outcome should be if someone proposed a box. So if everybody agrees, as an example, on a 40,000 square foot lot, I can put a 10,000 square foot building 4 stories tall. That's your shoebox. But then the next discussion is a broad interpretation of what that shoebox should look like. Is it something that maybe looks more like Seattle, less like South Kingstown, more like Boston, less like South Kingstown? So the next step is trying to articulate the aesthetic nature of the box. The draft that Jason gave us at Able East goes probably, I think, right now about 75 to 80% of the way on what that box aspires to be. I think what we're going to be looking at and discussing with feedback with the planning board is, do you leave it at that 80% where there's some interpretation, or do you look at an amendment to the contract to add the other 20% to be able to more clearly articulate your intended result? So there becomes less gray area and you're trying to make it more black and white. It'll be an understanding for the applicants and also an understanding and expectation from the planning board on what product is going to be delivered as a result of any changes in the regulations. So, again, everybody saw the pretty renderings. We got to make sure if that's what everyone's aspiring to have as a style, type, and density of development, that when an application comes in, you have the regulatory wherewithal to require that with maybe some slight deviation from it, but it's not a defunct interpretation of that lacks that articulation and fenestration that's shown in the pictures. No.
Caper?
You've actually opened the door to, every sentence opens the door to a new question. I guess my first overall conundrum is, how do we envision the overarching regulatory structure at the end of the day? Right now we've got zoning, which is really focused on land use, and now we're really you're talking about implementing form-based coding, which, as I understand it, is focused on size, shape, but it's not really focused on design. It's focused on size, shape, and the relationship of buildings and different structural attributes of the community, but I don't understand how it fits in to the overall regulatory structure. You were talking about amending the zoning to include it?
So I can talk, so right now you have an Euclidean form of zoning where it's dimensionally based on zones and separation of uses. What a form-based code does, and to your point, it is less concerned about the use. It allows the mixes. It allows residential to be with commercial, commercial to be with services, services to be maybe with some light manufacturing and widget assembly, and it's more concerned, to your point, about bulk and density. Within that, there's a framework of how that bulk and density is portrayed in the form of a building. And a number of form-based codes don't only just speak to the shoebox, they go slightly further and define how the shoebox should appear.
So they start dictating architectural features.
They don't dictate, they develop parameters that are deemed acceptable by the community.
So it creates choices.
So it still gives design flexibility to an applicant, it just eliminates some of the discussions. And we have a large storage building behind the Volkswagen dealership today. And if you take a building like that and you apply a form-based code, that may meet the bulk and density standards in a normal code. But if you adopted a code like that, and that was a result of the product of this really new regulation that you adopted, that could be upsetting to some. I think we have to work through that in the community discussions of whether that would be upsetting. So I think what Jason's done, and here's a couple examples. Here's a transect zone. And again, this is one of the larger commercial zones. It's not a gateway. Gateway's taller and bigger, but to the right, there are 6 examples of what may be deemed appropriate architecture within the transect zone. Not one of those buildings looks like the storage unit that was built behind the Volkswagen dealership. But I could design that storage building to have modifications in roof line. So if it said I needed to have 3 changes in roof line, I could do my parapet wall higher by 4 feet. And then if it said for every 100 feet of linear building, I had to bump out a minimum of 3 feet every 50 feet, well, I could do that. But it'd still look like that building. It would just bump out 3 feet in one area and the roof line would be modified. So the next step to the form is not necessarily dictating an exacting architectural requirement, but giving what's acceptable and what it wouldn't meet a code. So if you had these 6 buildings and then you showed a steel Butler building, you could simply say those 6 buildings meet the intent of the architectural rendering, and here are the 3 that don't. So there's flexibility, because there could be 6 interpretations of those 6 buildings shown there. But if you show them what absolutely doesn't meet a standard, then you shouldn't have a developer who tries to go there, right? But it's not dictating that every building has to have a 612 roof with 4 dormers, and it, or it has to have a mansard roof. It offers flexibility, but gives them something to aspire to.
When you say it offers flexibility, but it offers flexibility within certain constraints.
Yes.
So you're eliminating the cement block, but you're also probably eliminating creative architecture.
Well, again, that's a discussion. If I can try and blow this up. I would say the building at the bottom right is a modern interpretation on a historic vernacular. It has, I'm trying to get there. Let's get over there. We're gonna get there. So again, that's got a traditional building in the background, but a more modern interpretation to the storefront to the front. If that's something that you deem appropriate, that is still not a concrete block building or a steel Butler type structure within the zone. But I think there's the ability to have historic features with modern interpretations of that. And I think right now that's, we can all agree on the forms. It's the interpretation of the form to an end product.
It seemed to me that Jason's firm was very heavy in the architectural area. That's why we saw so many examples. And I certainly got the impression that they wanted to empower architectural creativity, but be specific in terms of lot coverage and other things that would help the site and the area as a whole to improve, like stormwater improvements, green infrastructure, landscaping, and so on. So I don't see this as limiting. It depends on how it is written. The other thing I wanted to ask is, Jason, when we met with him, he said he was very, very available, especially in January. And we're mid-January now. I know we've had a bit of a break, but I feel like this is moving rather more slowly than anticipated. and would really like to see us move forward and come up with some kind of a plan for receiving the drafts, setting up meetings. Jason said he would be very happy to meet with property owners, the council again, meetings open to the public. There was such a high degree of enthusiasm when we had that week-long charrette. I would hate to see that enthusiasm dwindle in any way, as well as the fact that, you know, everyone understands everyone is busy, but this has been in the pipeline for a couple of years now, and I really feel we need to do create some kind of an outline or work plan for this project specifically so that it can move forward. I don't know how others feel. Go ahead, Leslie.
No, I totally agree, Maria. If you look at his presentation, the whole front part is people meeting, people looking very enthusiastic, and then you get to the drawings. And I mean, I certainly think the drawings are exciting, but I think we've lost sort of the community enthusiasm for this project, and I don't want to see that happen. Excuse me. In terms of setting up any architectural guidelines, that's the way I look at it, design parameters or architectural guidelines. I don't think that's so much different than what we do now. I mean, if if an applicant comes before us with a very inappropriate, aesthetically inappropriate building, we find a nice way to say that, but we certainly do say that. So I don't think that's so different. I would want us to be careful how limiting the parameters are, because I don't think we want to become a design review body. I don't think we can, but I don't think that's our role.
I agree, it's not our role, but I guess I'm concerned, I loved everything, I loved a lot of the presentation, a lot of the landscaping and the spatial, the sensitivity about spacing and setbacks and eliminating some of the more unattractive features of our downtown. But what I'm concerned about really is, in the architectural component, there's a sameness. There's a textual sameness. And there's something very exciting about good design. And I'm not suggesting that your storage unit is good design. But, and my concern really is that I don't want to eliminate creativity and people coming forward with that kind of innovative thinking. And if you look at the architecture in cities, and I know we're not trying to create a city, we're trying to stick with a village and a community, but what struck me about all of the photographs is the village and their community that's portrayed reminds me an awful lot of Boston suburbs where I grew up, which are overly densely populated and unaffordable for too many people, or the Hamptons, which are overly densely populated and unaffordable for too many people. And, you know, that's what I think our community doesn't want. And I think that encouraging innovative architecture and encouraging innovative uses is what I want to remain open to. So, and I'm also puzzled, I'm sorry for jumping because I'm switching topics completely, but we're talking here on this plan, Old Tower Hill Road is already developed and it's owned a lot privately. How do we, I mean, and it looks like what we're planning on doing is changing that now. How do you do that? I mean, what's the idea here? I mean, I can understand how you can create a regulatory structure that's forward-looking, so you can work to adapt all change and implementation in the future. But what do you do about the existing? I mean, you know, take for example the before and after on the Shaw's parking lot.
Right, so in any regulatory setting, when there's a change, anything that exists can remain. Typically, you would allow a small modification to existing before they're required to adhere to any new regulatory requirements. So, an example of, take Shaw's, if, you had that existing structure and there's 2 out parcels. If one of those out parcels buildings wanted to expand by 1,000 square feet, there would, and this is where the devil's in the detail as you make these regulatory changes. It's not just about adopting this, it's also setting the parameters for when the regulation kicks in. So if you have an existing structure and someone wants to make a minor modification to that in a 10% or 20% realm, that they wouldn't have to tear down the building and adhere to this code, that they would be allowed some flexibility within their existing footprint. And all of that discussion has to take place. We'll do that internally first, try and see what's acceptable based on our knowledge and our experience, and then bring that to the planning board. The second aspect of that is, as properties get redeveloped, tear down, rebuild, there's 2 schools of thought. That this code becomes aspirational but not mandatory, or you make this code mandatory and any tear down, rebuild. And that's going to be a interesting conversation, because you take some of the, we'll say CBS wasn't there, and that was a single-family house, or a small 10,000 square foot Domino's Pizza, or we'll say Tim Hortons, because they went out of business. Actually, yes, Tim Hortons pulled out of the U.S. in most places on the East Coast. So it was a Tim Hortons, and someone's going to tear that down. Now, if you adopt this code, do you want them to tear it down and rebuild what you saw in this code? Or you give them the option to do it the way it's been done for the last 20 or 30 years, which means that corner could become a Cumberland Farms with a convenience store, 6 pumps, and a very large canopy. Because that's what our regulations would allow if you don't mandate it. So there's a lot of discussion in that aspect of it that hasn't taken place yet. People have asked the question of, are you going to make this mandatory? Is it going to be an overlay? Is it going to be an option for a person that could do this if they wanted to, but if they wanted to just do an old school strip mall, they can do old school strip mall. But you spend a significant amount of resources to show that there are better options to old school strip mall. But is the community and the regulatory bodies who can affect this change willing to mandate the change? And, Jason King was, and we've told you as planners, this is not going to happen overnight.
No, I
This is going to
understand.
take years.
But one of my concerns about the document that we're putting out is, if you look at the before and after here, this is really, it's what we're envisioning, and it's what one would be capable of doing if one puts the form-based codes into effect.
Yes.
But if you already have on-site construction, just take the Shaw's parking lot, and nobody wants to sell anything, nobody wants to change anything, you're not going to create the after until somebody who owns the Shaw's concourse wants to make a change or wants to sell it to somebody who wants
Correct.
to make a change.
Absolutely, yes.
Or
And
someone else. I mean,
Right.
you need a catalyst.
You need a catalyst, but my concern is that we want to make sure that the documentation is clear about that. Because my concern about just reading through the deck, if I were to hand it to a neighbor, which I didn't, but if I were, they'd think, oh, this is what it's going to look like tomorrow.
No.
And that, you've got a bunch of different things. One is just setting expectations. I'm all in favor of making it, it can be it can be mandatory prospectively. I mean, that makes sense to me, but I don't see how, it can't be mandatory retroactively. Well, I suppose.
No, again, from a
Under
regulatory
the new regime,
standpoint.
maybe it can.
But under any regulatory aspect of zoning, you cannot force someone to change what they already have. So if the Cavadas development for the next 20 years wants to continue as a auto-centric, retail service-orientated development and not undertake a tear-down rebuild, it's just if someday someone entertains a tear-down rebuild, what do you want that tear-down rebuild to look like? Just a reimagining of what already is there, or what Jason King, and through this process, which went through the community, shows you what could be. And the regulations, if mandatory, and a redo of the Cavadas would push you towards the regulatory side of what was envisioned versus just a redo of an auto-centric strip mall.
So I guess my biggest concerns are I want to be setting expectations for the reading public that are realistic. I mean, I want to be clear that this is guidance going forward.
Yeah.
It's not going to create a change overnight. And the second thing is I also want to be clear that it's not dictating the pictures of what could be, or not dictating the outcomes. Because I don't want to be squelching the creativity. I mean, there's some wonderfully designed communities all over the United States and more particularly in Europe that integrate a whole variety of styles, whereas when you look at the afters in some of these, there's a sameness about them all. And there's a lack of texture to it all. And I do recall in listening to one of the presentations when Jason was doing his thing, someone said, a number of people said they didn't want it to look like South County Commons. I see a lot of South County Commons in here, that's all.
And, you know, maybe that's I think that's a conversation we should have with Jason sooner than later. He said he is very accessible, and to keep this moving forward and make sure we're all on the same page, absolutely we should.
And I
try to
think
set
one of the
something
ways
up.
you encourage young talent is you give them the opportunity to submit designs. I mean, there's lots of different ways to encourage people to share innovative ideas, whether they get executed or not, partially or fully, you know, you can still encourage it. And I don't want to create a document that's really so forward-thinking and really trying to set a tone for the community for the future that stifles creativity.
Yeah.
I want to do the opposite.
No, and I think,
Robin was gonna, you were gonna say something.
Looking at the pictures from the presentation, the things that concern me are where would people get their groceries? Because if we open this up to financial advantageous residential developments, then what happens to our grocery store? That's a big concern. We don't want to become a desert, a food desert. Also,
go ahead, Robin, sorry.
when, let's say that you preserve Shaw's, but you've taken away all the parking, so unless I live in town, I can't shop in town because there's no place to park, and I'm not going to put a week's worth of groceries in my panniers and pedal home. And then one of the solutions in the presentation to that problem was to build multi-story parking garage, possibly at the expense of the town. And still, am I going to push my shopping carriage up the ramp in the parking garage and get my... Right, so I'm concerned about preserving the functionality of town. I also, when I look at Dale Carlisle Corner and the designs promoted for that, people smiling and sitting at tables where we all know there's heat and exhaust fumes and constant traffic, those developers are at least going to build big, tall walls there And that's what you'll be looking at, is a big, tall fence wall, not happy people breathing your exhaust fume and listening to some kids booming bass radio. So I think that, I don't know how the new zoning, rewriting our zoning can protect our community from having a place to shop. Otherwise, I mean, most of the people, well, maybe not most, but I don't know the ratio numerically, but a lot of people in South Kingstown don't live in Wakefield. We live on the outskirts of what we call town. And if we can't come to town to shop, we're going to be shopping in Narragansett or Westerly. So how do we preserve that, protect that? Thank you.
So I guess I'm thinking about the last two businesses down in Wakefield that have recently changed hands and redeveloped those sites. And I'm thinking about People's Credit Union and Chipotle. And in both of those cases, it was a national chain that had the resources to demolish a building and to rebuild. And I remember somebody appeared before us when Chipotle happened and said that they wanted a local business, a small business, who wanted to buy that site, and they just couldn't swing the expense of demolishing Chen's restaurant and building new. And so I worry that this kind of thing will only be affordable to national chains who are going to come in. And this, to me, looks like a lot of the towns along the 128 corridor around Boston, and a lot of these businesses are your Bed Bath & Beyonds and TJ Maxx's and Staples and other big buildings here. I don't know that any small businesses or independent businesses would have the resources to do something like this. But then further, I think maybe if we had told Chipotle or People's Credit Union that they had to follow this model to rebuild those, we had two, derelict, abandoned buildings in town, would they have simply walked away from that redevelopment? I mean, maybe these don't look like our vision, but at least they're not dilapidated, abandoned businesses, which they were. And I worry a little bit that if we make our aspirations too costly, that People's Credit Union wouldn't have moved a few doors down and built a really nice building. They would have just been like, well, it's just too complicated or too expensive, we'll just stay put. And so we would still end up with a falling down restaurant that won't be redeveloped because we've been too expensively aspirational about what we expect.
Or just to expand on that a little bit, when you're dealing with national franchises, they have their own dictates about what the design components have to be. So we want to be careful not to be creating a tension between what our expectations are and what theirs are. I mean, I think the trick is in the balance. How do you set the standards so that you eliminate some of the design issues that you've seen in the past and create an environment that's inviting the community feel that you want to continue going forward, but leave yourself open to to the different kinds of people that you want to be able to invite in and to develop, whether they're national chains or local businesses or both. And it's a balance. It seems to me that the strength of South Kingstown and the strength of Wakefield is that we are a neighborhood community. We service the population that's immediately here and in the surrounding environment, and so that we can cater to a large variety of people. And my concern is that we don't want to be limiting in terms of who we're going to be able to bring in and who we're going to be able to serve going forward.
So we have had in the past the national chain corporate monoculture type applicants come before us. And two of the more notable ones, I would say, are Hampton Inn and Dollar General. And even though we did not have the regulatory authority, we were able to get them to modify their typical type of design and have something that is well-suited to the town, even though we didn't have the regulatory authority to do so. And this is one way to give us a little more oomph in that area, without saying it has to look like that picture.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that hasn't been discussed tonight is, this is a mixed-use project, which means a strong residential component should be part of this, and it was part of the plan all along. And whereas at South County Commons, you have residential in one area, commercial in other parts of the area as a whole, you don't have that true integration of mixed use, whereas this would allow for that.
Yeah, again, I think the discussion is very warranted tonight, very good and productive. I probably have some answers for the questions that were here. I'll defer to Jason being able to listen to this and respond as our resident expert working on this, but I think there are a lot of answers to the questions you have. Just a couple observations. We can't control rents. Rents are driven by the private sector and the marketplace. If there's a lot of supply and not a lot of demand, then the rents go down. If there's a ton of demand and not a lot of supply, the rents go up. And in some instances, there's a balance so that rents are affordable in certain areas of town for certain types of businesses, and rents are less affordable in other points of town. You know, there are only certain tenants that can afford to be on the corner of Main and Main because its location and its price point and its market conditions. So the higher the prices for the corners of Main and Main, that's typically when you see the larger corporate CVS's, Walgreens at those corners, because the small mom and pop can't afford the price point. But the town doesn't necessarily control that, the marketplace controls that. So there are a lot of factors there. In any redevelopment proposal that Dover and Cole originally, and Jason King working with Dover and Cole, now with Able East, tried to accommodate a mix. Again, he has to show, the architectural team and urban design team has to show you something so that you can react to it, right? And we don't have the financial wherewithal to show you 30 options. But if we looked at the Shaw's, that shopping center in the Wakefield Mall, if you had 4 different design firms, they would come up with 4, to Capers Point, they'd come up with 4 different types of development, potentially at different densities, and you could give them different parameters. To Robin, to your point, when Jason King and his team laid this out, in order to accommodate the density, you were infilling parking. And in order to keep the density and keep the gross leasable area beholding to the mall's existing square footage and then addition to it, you had to replace that parking. And the only way to replace that parking was in structured parking. There are.
Turn your mic on.
We can't hear
Just restate what you said.
Right, you've got the issue of how far you're going to walk with your groceries, and the other issue, especially if you've got a couple of kids tagging along with you too, and the other issue is who's going to pay for that municipal parking. And I've totally lost the other thing I was going to say.
Again,
You were commenting on the density in certain times of the year,
Oh.
or under certain
That parking lot can be
Full.
full.
It can be around the holidays.
All the holidays.
It was more overfull. And the traffic, I love the illustrations of the traffic, clearly done by people who haven't driven along those streets during the holidays.
So again, this is an exploration. The town council asked for this to be done. You're getting to vet this and work through this. And in the end, planning board makes recommendations to council. Council will take action or not take action on this. But again, it's providing input and coming up with the regulatory guidelines this is something that the town council wants to entertain as a regulatory change, that you work with them on the parameters associated with the guardrails. you know, to Liz's point, again, there's always an interpretation of architectural style and building fenestration and articulation. It's just trying to develop guardrails. Maria made a point on a retail development that came to town in the last couple of years that it would have been an easier starting point if you had some guardrails. Instead, they started at their, I want to say, lower end of their typical corporate prototype and ended up at the very higher end of their corporate portfolio. If you had regulations in the beginning that articulated the guardrails that already put them in the top tier of their architectural willingness to do these types of buildings, they would have started there. And one of our goals is to kind of eliminate the broader band shades of gray and narrow them down and get the applicants to focus a little more to make your lives easy as planning board members, so when you start to see something, it's really close to what you're achieving as an end product versus starting at one end of the spectrum, trying to get to the complete other end of the spectrum. But there's flexibility. That Dollar General store, there's still 6 other variations of that exist on the Upper East Coast. I think we probably have a top 4 building on the Upper East Coast, but depending on who you talk to, they may put us 1 and they may, or someone may put them 2, but it's much easier even for the planning department when a developer comes in and says, okay, I'm proposing to build this. We can immediately start with, well, if you're proposing to build this, here are your guardrails. Right now the conversation is here's what the town is aspiring with regards to aesthetics and look, and the regulatory guidelines are very broad, and we're trying to get them a little more focused, but allowing the flexibility of that design freedom so it's not cookie cutter, we'll call it Nantucket shingle side, every building looks similar to the other building, that there's some flexibility. I think some of the uniqueness of Wakefield and Main Street is the eclectic mix of different types of building, which made Main Street unique. But in Caper and your point, if I go to the Newton and the Natick and the Brooklines and in those areas in Medford, and I look at what's being built as a tear down infill, it's more Northern Pacific replacement and has lost some of its ties to New England. If you look at the triple decker that's being torn down in Boston and what it's being replaced to, it has no ties to that historic vernacular. What we're saying is there's an interpretation of that historic vernacular that doesn't look like it came from Portland, Oregon, right? So it's building those guardrails, but again, allowing that interpretation of that. And I think there's flexibility there. And going back to Robin's point, there's got to be buy-in by the community. It's got to be buy-in by the regulatory guidelines. But again, this doesn't happen over time. What you see in this picture here may happen only in a downturn in the economy where there's high vacancy rates and a resurgence of an economy. Because if you have a fully leased building, you are less likely to not re-sign leases, lose revenue for 3 or 4 years while you tear down, rebuild. But if you have a half vacant building or a 75% vacant building, you may be likely to do a tear down and a rebuild. We're not at that economic profile right now. We have, most of our buildings are occupied. There may be some changeover, but there's fairly high non-vacancy rates on Main Street and in this commercial district. So again, this is almost a generational change, but if you don't entertain something like this, your existing regulations basically get you more of what you already have. It's just a regurgitation, slight modernization of what you have. Strip mall, auto-orientated without that mixed-use component.
So
Jam-
this form-based code, your points,
Microphone, Caper.
I'm sorry, I love your points, but would the form-based code be limited to the study area, or would it be broader? Because I'm thinking of all of the old mill buildings, and some of the, those buildings are great for artists, but I don't see that, I don't envision the current uses staying for a particularly long period of time. And there's a lot of upkeep needs in that area. I mean, if part of it may be just, I'm new to the presentation, and the focus is so specifically narrow, but if we're going to be implementing form-based codes, are they going to be limited to the study area that's shown on slide 3, or is it going to be broader?
The whole idea was to start with this one area because it had been the subject of a URI class and is, for many reasons, a good test site to do this. And there have been, 15, 20 years ago, there was a Palisades Mill reuse study done, to your other point, but yeah, so that it can be manageable and be, a beginning of sort.
Very few towns on the Upper East Coast have made a wholesale change from Euclidean zoning to form-based. Most communities have undertaken that. There's 3 or 4 in Connecticut. There's, again, a handful in Massachusetts and a couple examples in Rhode Island have done incremental changes to the regulations to introduce form-based code with the mindset that if you can understand it, use it, work with it over time, that you may be able to have the palette to expand it into other areas in the community. Even larger places, in the Virginia Beach area, Richmond area, they've done urban areas or offsets to revitalizing urban suburban downtowns, but haven't done wholesale changes to the entire community. No one's suggesting that there should be a form-based code for Kingston Village right now or Route 108. If there's success here and people say, hey, there's success here, it works, it's more palatable to the development community, it's more beneficial and efficient for the planning board in reviewing applications, I think there will be a discussion, and there has been, very broad brushed, of, well, if it works in Old Tower Hill, would it work on 108 along the corridor by Tony's Pizza? Would it work in West Kingston? Would it work in Peacedale? We're not quite there yet. We've had the discussion at the very basic level, but we're still looking at a success somewhere on this regulatory guideline. It's a change, and then there's the potential to expand it.
Well, also, I think once it's enacted, it serves as a model of what kind of variation or variances you might want to ask for, what might be acceptable, so I'm fine with that.
As we've talked about, and as Caper talked about tonight, we're talking about a very long vision to achieve some of these goals that we all seem to be very eager to see. And it makes me wonder if there's some other mechanism to instill some pieces of it that would potentially jumpstart the process, but also make it a more attractive and appealing place. And for example, I'm thinking about the entranceway to Shaw's with the gigantic granite block, the cement blocks and the broken stop sign. I realize that that's private property. And I'm also thinking about the corner in front of Wakefield Liquors, and I know it's private property, but it makes me wonder if there's other resources, if the town or there's grant or some kind of way that we could kickstart, say, an alley of trees going into the Shaw's parking lot, or a small park at that corner, which is shown up in Jason's plans. Because we are at the mercy of all of the individual property owners becoming inspired to spend a lot of money to create our vision. Are we, as a community, able to kick in to achieve some portions of it that would help in the shorter term, the aesthetic that we're hoping to see.
Again, Susan, a good and valid point. Those are discussions that will continue, will be vetted. I think Jason King had brought that up and some aspects talking about tax incremental financing, and that this is, if this is happening, and you know a development's coming in, and there's one change sparks another, that could you use part of the taxes from a redevelopment and earmark it to a special management district? There are mechanisms to do this. There just has to be a palette for it. Someone has to want to do this. And again, you've had a lot of existing properties. Ocean State Job Lot used to be Benny's. That is in essence the same development since it's been built. They have, in that development without a redo. Right, but there's a conversation that continues and needs to be had, and it can't just lie. Similar to adopting cottage regulations. You adopted them in the hopes that someone would apply, but you can't make anyone apply. You could adopt this regulation. You could not adopt this regulation and nothing changes on the corridor for 10 years because no one's ready to make a change, even in their existing format. You could adopt this regulation and nothing happens for 10 years because it's not a result of the regulation. It's just a result of the property owner's position in their life cycle that they don't want to entertain change, whether this regulation went forward or not. What it does give someone the opportunity to do is entertain change and density not currently allowed under the regulation. So if I bought Bank of America as a developer, my options right now are to pretty much do what's there. Because if I wanted to do mixed use and do something very creative and move the buildings up to the street, I'm not allowed because my setbacks prohibit me from doing that. If I wanted to potentially go to 4 stories, I'm limited by 35 feet. I can't go to 4. If I wanted to reduce my parking, I can't because I have to have X number of spaces per. So there are things that are, again, aspirational, but we can't make any one individual owner within this corridor come to the table. The only thing we can supply for them is the ability to increase density, which potentially increases return on investment, which could spark something in a landowner or in someone who's looking to develop, acquire a piece of land to do something beholding to the new regulation.
So just to go back to a point that Maria raised, should we be getting together with Jason King and his team before the next iteration comes out? I mean, I've always found in creating documents that it was more constructive to have conversations before the product is circulated rather than after.
Again, that's part of the conversation you had with the PowerPoint presentation. That's part of this conversation tonight. And again, I'll talk to Jason about when he can come back and continue this conversation and perhaps expand upon some of the answers and questions you had tonight.
I agree that we should do that, but I'm a little bit concerned that the review of the draft, which we have not seen, is too internal at this point within the planning department. And I think we should be having conversations with Jason and be able to see the draft. And, it will ultimately be a better product.
Well, I'd be happy to review a draft and go forward with that conversation. I'm more concerned about not having a final come out. I think people are more open to input when something's in draft form than when they've already decided it's final. Somehow or other, correcting all those typos makes you not want to change content.
And, Jason also had stated that what they added to the end of the document was kind of a generic form-based code. And in order to further that effort, it's going to take time, communication, and some funding. And I believe the expectation from the town council was that that would be part of this entire endeavor. So, again, I think that needs to, I think we need an outline of the steps that we're going to take from today moving forward.
I think that we definitely need to talk about how many stories we're going to be looking at. In the pictures in the slides, whenever they talked about 4 stories, there was this tiny little gable on the end of the building that popped out, and they're like, no, that's not 4 stories. And I think that that's one of our most important steps, is to put a limit on these skyscrapers. I mean, you talk about planting trees that are going to be trying to grow in the shade of buildings.
And Jason did say that that was going to be and should be a community conversation as far as what building height is going to be easily accepted by the community. But again, yeah, we need to get to that.
Didn't we have that?
Not really. I mean, he in some of his examples, he showed, okay, this is a 3-story, this is a 4-story, but we didn't really have that conversation,
But when we were at the charrette and we put stickies on things and we made notes and stuff, I think there was a consensus, I don't know what it was, but wasn't there a consensus of people cringing from some things and embracing other things? And I would hope that that information was captured, because that was sort of the decisions are made by those who showed up. And the people who showed up for the charrette obviously had opinions, and some people loved some things and hated some things. And so right there, I think your starting point is, if most of the people that came to the charrette hated 4-story but loved 3-story, maybe that's where we start. And so if he captured that, and if it's in the draft, which we haven't seen, then maybe that's a place we start, is how did those charrette people feel about what was presented, which we don't know.
That's not coming through in the current presentation.
That was,
Like what the
Yeah.
The current presentation goes through the alternatives so that you can pick each as if the audience was neutral. So having been someone who came to this process late, I would have no idea that people had put in their stickers to show what their opinions were, because that doesn't come through. Or if I thought that they had put in their opinions, I would have thought they were very evenly divided, because there's no point of view coming through in the presentation. And I don't know, when there's a draft document, I don't know if it's going to be another deck or if it's going to be a document that's readable. But if it's a deck, I'm hoping that it's not in the manuscript that we currently have, because it's very difficult to read the text.
Jamie said 200 pages. So probably,
I'm happy with 200 pages,
glad
as
you're
long as I can do it, I can control the font size.
well,
So if we promise to keep it in our
I want to say,
pockets,
134.
if we keep it in our pockets and we don't put it out in the public, can the board review that draft and just get back to you with,
Once we release it to the board, it's a public document.
it's sort of like the comp plan, where we all kind of had a look at it
Once-
before,
Once we release it to the board, it's a public document.
but that doesn't have to be a problem, but, okay.
Yeah.
Why
we do
isn't
that
it a
all the
public-
time. We
pay-
get drafts of things, yeah.
We paid for it. But is there a reason that we couldn't release a draft for that conversation to start?
Within the next 2 weeks, we'll have the conversation with Jason, and we should be able to release the draft. So that is 14 days to the 28th.
And we'll be equally able to mark it up and change things after that is released to the public and to us.
Again, it's a working document, it's not a final document. It is a draft being vetted by the planning board to refine and have an end product. And again, it is understand it's a report. And the difficulty is you have two segments. There's the report segment, which is the first, we'll say, half, and then the second half are the regulatory aspects. The regulatory aspects lay out the framework. That's where you need to dive deeper on the implications. The report gets you to the regulations. So I want, the report summarizes the results of the charrette, where the likes and dislikes were, where you were headed on density, where you were headed on articulation and fenestration of architecture, style, and then you get to the regulations, which support some of the results of the design that came from the charrettes. But again, it's got to be a working, breathing document, because if you have a conversation and Jason King's saying, I'm just going to use him, 4.5 stories, and the planning board says, no, 4 tops, and only 4 in this transect zone, you don't have to do 4 in every zone. There's kind of a stepping stone to everything. There's transition from 1.5 story, 2-story, single-family homes, which abuts this zone. Then you step up to 2 or 3, then in the internal you may be taller, and then you step back down as you go back out to the residential. But that's the regulatory realm of it. So, I want to say just about all of you but Caper, because you became a member later on, participated in the charrette. So you're familiar with kind of what's in your mind of what the resulting verbiage and pictures are as a result of that charrette process that's in the document. But now you're getting into the regulations, and I think what was clear in our contract is we're going to get a substantial model regulation, but if you want to really dive down deep and refine it and spend the next 3, 4, 5, 6 months refining it and honing it, that's an amendment to the contract. And we have funds to be able to amend that contract and keep Able City on board for a slightly expanded scope.
Well, let's try to set this up, because I do think that draft has been around for some time, so it seems, and the planning board needs to be part of the process. We need to be moving forward. We need to have that communication with Jason, who is very willing to do so. So let's...
So again, I'll check his availability for your February workshop, or whether there's a date in February, because I want to say the workshop could move left or right potentially of that date based on availability.
Or if we have a special meeting with him so we can move this along.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move on to our next agenda item, is the 2025 work program.
Madam Chair, I did do a quick handout as a follow-up to correspondence we have given you. It's this 8.5 by 11 spreadsheet. I'm sorry, I just want to pull that up on my screen. And just, looking at a few of the things, one of the primary things that we have funding for is undertaking activities and implementation of the comprehensive community plan, including zoning ordinance amendments and bringing that zoning ordinance into conformance with the future land use plan. And just under that is reviewing the existing ordinance and we'll say modernizing it. We've been working with a zoning ordinance that's pushing 40 years old, that has various amendments and changes to it. And there are, and I can have Jay expand upon this because he deals with this every single day, where there are some circular references and redundancies, and there have been Band-Aids over the years put on the regulations, but we've been talking about over time. And it's not a new regulation, it's a formatting of what exists, removing the redundancies, removing the circular references, and making it much more user-friendly, both on the planning board side, staff size, and developer size. And we have funding in place, it was approved last year in the capital improvement program, and we have some consulting funds in my operational budget for the department where we can start to take this on this spring.
Can you just explain a little bit more what you mean by this? Andy and I were the only ones who were around for the Phase 2 zoning project that followed a comp plan rewrite. Are we talking about that, or are we talking about minor updates? things that need to be modified based on legislation that's been passed, like writing the specs for the standards for special use permits. So exactly what are we
think
talking about here?
It's a little of everything you just mentioned.
Uh-huh.
It is taking our regulations and going through them and saying if there's 4 different sections that talk about landscaping, that should be in one section. So if we use that as an example, if there are 4 references to landscaping, there's references to landscaping in the special management districts, there's references to landscaping in the government institutional associated with hospitals, there's landscaping general to the regulations, and then there's landscaping contained in the subdivision regulations. There are multiple places that developers and staff have to go to advise people of consistency with the landscape plan or a buffering plan. Parking resides in multiple places within the regulations. So if we modernize and update, I'm not necessarily saying changing standards, it's just putting them in a very methodic, orderly manner. So if someone says, I have a bank and I want to do a drive-through, what are my standards for a drive-through? Oh, there are none. Well, how many cars do I need to stack? There are no standards for stacking cars. How many parking spaces do I need? What's the buffer? Well, let me check if there's one in this section, there's one in another section. We need to be more concise, and which will result is efficiency both on the staff level, planning board level. We're not looking, in essence, to change significant standards until we kind of recodify and then look hard at those standards and see if we need to change anything. Part of that are the design standards, part of that are the landscape standards, lighting standards other than dark sky compliant are kind of silent on other aspects of lighting. So again, it's a reorganization primarily, and then an update where it needs to be updated based on input from the planning board with regards to structural standards.
Andy, could you just, for the benefit of the board, and based on what Jamie's saying, give everyone just a kind of an explanation of what this kind of an undertaking is like?
Well, I think what has happened is over the years, and particularly with the recent major changes from the General Assembly, we've been reactive rather than proactive. We've had to react to these different things as they've come up. And things get put in different places, and sometimes they get cross-referenced and sometimes they don't. And what I think the town would probably benefit from is a comprehensive review of both the zoning ordinance and the regulations and look through. There's probably a lot of duplication that could be eliminated. And, clarified to help them make sense, so that we don't have conflicting stuff or don't have to go looking in multiple places. That's what I would envision, I think, would be that sort of comprehensive review and rewrite. So you're not going to have like a red line version of the zoning ordinance and the subdivision thing, because it wouldn't make sense. You're going to have a whole new version of both of them. And further complicated if you're going to have a section on form-based development that you're not going to just put over the entire town.
Yeah, and I've been asked this before, as you undertake this, do we get a red line version? And it's extremely difficult if you have 4 cross-references to just say deleted, because when you're deleting it in 4 different places, someone's asking, well, where do those 4 deletions now end up? And what you have, there's some leap of faith and trust that those 4 references that were deleted appear in a systematic place in a better organized document. So when we, I've always been taught when you have a definition, it should be in your definition section. We have definitions that are in definitions, and we have definitions within paragraphs on the regulatory side of what something is. Like the definition of hospital isn't under hospitals, it's under the hospital explanation under government institutional uses. So if I go and look for what's the definition of a hospital, I go to definition, and I'm using this as an example. I look for hospital, not that. Well, do I have to word search the whole document for hospitals to see where hospitals is mentioned and how they define it?
So is this going to be online, where if you're reading the section on government institutions, there's a little thing you click on that jumps you to that definition wherever it is in the document? Like, if this is all going to be online, maybe it'll be easier to link?
That's another discussion. The last consultant I was involved with in a rewrite of regulations was early on in the world of hyperlinking things. So it's possible you can do that. It's a different approach and a different skill set, so that if someone does a word search or if they're in the hospital regulations and they want to click on it, it'll bring you to different places. So there's an aspect of that. I'll leave that to, Jay and Brian deal
Yeah.
day to day with everything.
Susan,
But there's aspects of that are important. Sorry, Jay.
the website, the code website that we use to host the code, has some of that functionality built in. There are two primary code providers that I know of. In my opinion, one does a little bit better job than the other, but the website has that capability of linking correctly, and if we needed to, we could reference the definition as you had used as an example.
Right. So I wonder if, right now, it seems to be a problem that there's information in multiple places, but if it was all linked to the same consistent explanation, would it even matter how many places it appears? Because if it all links back to one regulation and not...
If I'm understanding-
I think
If I'm understanding correctly, one of the concerns is that the information appears in multiple places, but it may not appear in the same way in multiple places. So the first issue is reconciling those so that you don't have discrepancies in meaning that have happened because as changes were made over time, they were made only in some places but not in others. So you're talking about a comprehensive overview to get, I think of it as almost a stylistic editing exercise, whereas substantive, which you're not going to redline because it's going to be too complicated to review. But if there's a conflict and substantive changes are required, I think that's something we might want to be alerted to.
Yeah, and you would be. They'd certainly do it. I mean, when we did it before, it was done manually, but there was kind of like a master copy of the documents, which had notes written where things end. Towards the end, we had someone go through, and double check the work where it had been. In fact, there was a particular citizen member at the time who used to come to all the meetings and read things very carefully and always ask these embarrassing questions. And we reached out to him and said, would you proofread this? Here's the version, proofread us and give us let's not wait you don't have to wait for the public hearing. We'd like your input first. As long as you're going to read the whole thing anyway, let's give you first crack at it. So, I think that's still the thing. It needs a holistic view and that's what your consultant's going to do in the first place, and the end result is read the whole things together and say, okay, does this make sense? And ask those questions. Does there need to be something maybe at the beginning of the definitions that says, 4 definitions of specific special uses, check Article 6 or something, ask those questions and do it. That's what it would be.
And then we'll explore some things such as the structure of the regulation, because if we get a phone call from a developer who says, I'm looking at purchasing a property in the commercial downtown, and it's on the screen here, and says, well, what can I do there? Well, we don't have a list for commercial downtown and all the opposed uses. We have to tell them, go to this page and start scrolling. So here's commercial downtown, uses are on the left. Where you see a yes, it's allowed. Where you see a no, it's not allowed. Well, wouldn't it be nice if we just had a table that showed all the uses that are allowed in the commercial downtown? And if it's not on that list, it's not allowed. So there's some simplifications we can do that make it more user-friendly. Doesn't mean we abandon this table. We may just have a supplement to this table that is cross-referenced and linked, so that if someone says, you know, what are the uses allowed in the neighborhood commercial? There's a list of 20 uses. Well, where's that different than downtown? Here's the list of those uses. And someone can easily see what's allowed and not allowed. And then you may see that, you know, drive-throughs. And, you know, and there are aspects to that, because Jay's point with today's modernization of zoning codes and the ability to search, so if someone wants to know about drive-throughs, they can pull up the regulations and say drive-throughs. It should only go to 1 or 2 sections of the regulations. It shouldn't go to 10. And we're going to try and fix that a little bit. Okay. It is a pretty big task.
I just had 2 points I wanted to make on that, if I can remember what they were. In regards to the getting down and dirty with the zoning part of it. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. We've had, basically, when you look at the zoning ordinance, there's been 2 decades of amendments that have kind of been done hodgepodge and haven't been done necessarily 100% accurately. So as Jamie was saying, there's still some remnants of things that were supposed to be removed that were missed because they were in different sections, yada, yada. The other important component of this, though, I think, is that all the things that the planning board wants a good development to be is where you're going to get it in the zoning ordinance. So taking a second look at the standards for a parking lot or for something like that and getting down and dirty into saying, like, in today's standards, what's it like? You have the ability of, that's where you can make the requirement of saying that it has to be X, Y, and Z. And those are the important characteristics that we absolutely need to maintain and uphold, and that's what makes it exceptionally important. The flow and the reference and all that stuff is just an annoyance, and in some instances it does create, you don't know if it's black or white, like just by the way the language is written. Sometimes in the subregs, when you read the subregs, some of it gets extra wordy, and by the time you finish reading it, you don't really know what it said. So it's little things like that. When you're looking for a quick answer, you don't want to have to decipher code to try to understand it. So I think we're at a point now where enough time has gone by and the times have changed. I mean, we have saloon as a use code, as a use type, and we don't allow saloons. We don't allow drinking establishments without food.
Always call that one out.
Yeah,
Right, 'cause
right.
it's
That's an easy example,
silly.
but
Yep.
there are a few of those, and I think
Yeah,
after
there
a
are.
couple of decades, it's worthy to revisit and look back and try to see if you can get some value out of it.
When we went through the use codes, we saw several examples of that, but we were not allowed to talk about it at the time.
And again, this is not a 3-month project.
Right.
This-
Oh,
this
understood.
This is a relatively
It's-
heavy lift.
Yeah,
This is
that's
6
what-
months, 12
yep.
months, or even longer, but
So as this is such a bear and it's all in your laps, is there a hand that other interested planning people can do that would help move this along, help make it easier, help tidy it up? Like, well, instead of paying somebody from outside, like, I don't know.
Not an in-house project.
Like, you know,
No.
it's a great idea and it's all in your lap.
I would say, generally speaking, yes, always. But in practical means, you're not always going to have a person that you can rely on that you would need to at that level. You know, that they would need to be able to react. They would need to be able to get things done. Life couldn't get in the way. And, you know, we have a meeting tonight and we're supposed to go over chapter 3 and I haven't had a chance to look at it. Well, that's tough. But we are always looking for help. It's sure. You can feel free to get involved at any point. Carrying the load like that, though, is tough.
yeah. And I think one of the key components too, and Jay alludes, is we'll welcome help, but we'll use parking as an example. if we reorganize the parking section, right? We haven't really dealt with standards. But all of a sudden, as we're reorganizing the parking section, and we look at it and we go, we're looking at the parking section, and basically it calls out the width of a space associated with a drive aisle, but it doesn't talk about how a parking lot functions, right? So you haven't seen this, you haven't had a development that has a 300-space parking lot. Our regulations say a 300-space parking lot shall have parking spaces that are either 9 by 18 or 10 by 20 with a drive aisle no less than 12 feet, so it accounts for the square footage of that, and then there's a landscaping code of that. But does it say I can drive diagonal from one corner of the 300-space parking lot to the other corner of the space with no mandatory end cap islands? Or separation for every 4 rows of parking, you need an island, so you can't cut 30 miles an hour diagonal through 6 parking bays, zipping through the parking lot like you can at some of our illustrious parking lots now. Or when you exit a row of parking, there's no end cap, so you watch people driving down a row of parking, not realizing they just entered the main kind of arterial flow to a shopping center as someone slamming on their brakes because that person just thought they were driving down an aisle and didn't realize they entered a 4-way intersection. So when we get to those components, it may be appropriate to have a subcommittee of that we can say, look, we're at the parking section now. Our consultant's reorganizing it and doing everything, but we want to talk to you about some of the shortfalls of our parking regulations now, so that we can use a subcommittee to potentially make some changes and better organize and better articulate an end product for parking lots. End caps. I talked to a few of you about the landscape code. Basically is for every parking space you should have X number of square feet of landscaping, but it doesn't necessarily tell you where that landscaping could be. So in my analysis of a 300-space parking lot, can a developer take 300 spaces times the square footage and put that all in one corner? Now the regulations say they probably can. As a planning board, you're not going to find that acceptable. So if you don't find that acceptable, shouldn't we change our regulations to better articulate where that landscaping should be a minimum of 20,000 square feet and can't be in one spot on the development, that it has to be arranged in a certain manner? So those are discussions that we can do at the subcommittee level as we go through this. There's a lighting component, there's a landscape component, there's, layout components, there's setback components in all of the districts, there's lot coverage discussions, there's drainage discussions. Yeah, there's all kind of things that once we restructure and reorganize, we're going to have tons of question of handling applications as 3 planners over the last 4.5 years, 5 years, and almost 6 years. Where have the shortfalls been and where can we plug the holes? Versus just continuing to put Band-Aids on the regulations. No. So, again, I don't see a consultant going away for 12 to 18 months and coming back and saying, here, I'm done. Guys, read 200 pages of reorganized regulations. There's got to be a systematic approach. So.
Yep.
And I think you really have to do this kind of cleanup before you enact form-based coding, because it's all going to intersect and overlap, and if you're trying to you don't want to add to the chaos.
Well, I think
It would certainly be a lot easier to do it that way, because then you could create a nice landing pad for the form-based code.
it would
Exactly,
be,
and it also, the kind of editing process that you're talking about will illuminate some of the conflicts and some of the questions that your form-based code, you may want your form-based code to address.
again, I'm agreeing, but also disagreeing. I don't want to put, if everybody's comfortable with the form-based code. The form-based code can exist as an addendum to the regulations and just replace the neighborhood commercial zone associated with Old Tower Hill. Anything within the outline, go to addendum A, and that is the regulatory basis that stands on its own. So literally, when you're in that zone, you don't go to the 200-page zoning code, you go to the 40 or 50-page form-based code, and that's the regulatory guidelines
Like we did with the SMD on Route 1.
with SMD. So they
Right, but
can
you want
function
them to be
independently.
reconcilable, you don't want them
Yeah,
to be in...
and again, I've worked
yeah.
in one municipality where they did that, and someone missed a very critical section of the regulations that linked the form-based code back to the architectural design standards. They left the sentence out.
So just to clarify, if in this area you have to put in 3 trees, but if our regular ordinance, you only have to put in 1 tree, we can enforce the 3 trees. That the
Yes.
other ordinance, the rest of town won't
Yes, yes,
override?
right.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
So
Huh,
the
that's
form-based codes, we'll use the parking lot example. The form-based code states that when you do a parking lot, your perimeter of your parking lot has to have a 2-inch caliber street tree and give a broad range of variety. 40 feet on center around the entire perimeter, that will be effective to the area, regulatory area of the form-based code. It won't apply to 108 by Tony's Pizza in a neighborhood commercial, or a neighborhood commercial by URI. It will only apply there. If you require understory and those dimensions, that will apply to the form-based code regulatory parameters of that zone. And that's the way Jason structured this.
Can we move down the list, and can we talk about DPR and what's going to happen with that?
So again, DPR, I just got an email today from Amy, continuing our conversation about Band-Aid term, regulatory changes to DPR, and what is the DPR role. The changes in the legislation have really shifted regulatory responsibilities from the zoning board to the planning board. So, and I'll let Andy expand upon this, but a lot of the functionality of the zoning board as it relates to variances and special use permits have been shifted to the planning board, but we don't necessarily have all the regulatory structure in place. We have this all the time in our office where we get an application and we're like, well, the tradition of this would go zoning board, it would require special use, comes to planning under DPR, then goes back to zoning board. What application are we and what's the structure? We're working internally on that structure, so that will in all likelihood be one more Band-Aid before we do a real deep dive into zoning, and we're working on that with legal.
Jay, do you want to add anything to this? Remember with the hospital, we had that conversation about land development project versus DPR and the whole, trying to find a happy medium.
You're on the spot, Jay.
Yeah, I do vaguely remember that. All I can tell you is that the DPR discussion is a cluster. Yeah, they've added, so what formerly was DPR, a lot of it is no longer. And some of that was DPR is now minor land development. And it leaves a very narrow, very small window of things that actually qualify for DPR. Development plan review.
So, there used to be, at least in my view, there was a sense of hierarchy. And you had, if it was something just a small development, it's generally either an impact or size, and we had it defined, then it would be done by development plan review, which usually meant it was either staff or it went to the technical review committee. It didn't go to a nighttime meeting of the planning board. And those were divined out. And those were ideas. These are things that we want to just take a look at, see how it's done, make sure the layout's okay, so forth. Maybe there were design issues, but minor impact. And then the next step up would be a minor land development project. And then if it was a big deal, it would be a major land development projects. And land development projects would go to the planning board. Usually a minor land development project would be a one meeting of the planning board. A major land development would be multiple meetings, just like a major subdivision. It would be a master plan and a preliminary meeting, and final if you did final through the planning board. So that was kind of the concept, small, medium, and large, as far as developments and their impact. The General Assembly basically changed much of the land development, as they did with the subdivisions, raising it from 5 to 10, and the land development projects, and said that most of these land development projects are going to be by staff and not by the planning board. They changed the thresholds and whatnot, so that most land development project, a lot of it would not be by the planning board. They happened to leave development plan review with the planning board, because they didn't realize they were leaving, they weren't looking at the whole thing, they left it behind. So at that point, a lot of us, including South Kingston, moved stuff to development plan review. And we had that big debate one night about, are we going to have planning board do development plan review or not? And the answer was yes. And okay, we're going to move things to development plan review so that you as a planning board would still have the opportunity to look at it. The legislature, realizing that, changed it again last year, and instead of development plan review saying including but not limited to, I think 7 or 8 categories, said this is it. Took out that included and not limited to and just shall be, and there's this very limited list of categories of things that can be development plan review. So that has led everybody to speculate, and there's debate going around among email lists and people with the planners and the legislative committee. And I look this way because there's some from here. Your staff is participating in it. They're involved as well. These discussions, well, maybe we should be moving things to minor land development projects so that there's a more thorough review there. Well, but is that right? Do we really want this stuff to go through such a cumbersome process if it's minor? So that is still very much in a mess. And the planners, the legislative committee working with the League of Cities and Towns, and also now there's a group of municipal solicitors meeting by Zoom every month, trying to get together to craft a proposed solution that would make some sense of it. The general concept, the General Assembly, in particular the Speaker, I think is going to keep to the general concept that, this is, meetings of boards are red tape that slow down development and housing. And the general thrust is going to be more to be done by staff and not the boards for that stuff. And I don't think that's going to change. If anything, it's going to continue to develop even more. But at least we try to get a logical step, and so that at least maybe the major things would in fact still come to the planning board, and have the public hearings for the major developments without tying up the minor. That's the question. How do you get one without the other? How do you get the majors in without tying up everything? Because you don't have development plan review as a tool anymore to deal with the minor projects. So I don't know where it's going to go, other than in the general directions. And then tied with that is, as Jamie had said, the general thing of the zoning board is going away. My prediction is in 5 to 10 years we won't have zoning boards and planning boards. We'll have one municipal board. It's already in the law from last year, voluntary. If you wanted to, you could do it today. I think, and the zoning board is being gradually stripped of its functions more and more. Anything that requires planning board approval along with whatever zoning, is now required to be unified development, as you know, and come to you as the planning board. Appeals from the planning board no longer go to the zoning board, but go straight to Superior Court. So the zoning board is kind of currently left with variances or special use and special use permits. So we got rid of a lot of special use permits with the requirement for objective defined standards. So the zoning board's got some special use permits left, and it's got variances where there's no development. It's really kind of single-family lots, people building a garage, building an addition in their house, whatever. They don't have enough lot area. It's mostly dimensional issues. Decks and sheds, yeah. And ADUs that don't fit the requirements, ADUs that are on too small lots. And then the other aspects of the zoning board would be appeals from the building official and appeals from the Historic District Commission, which still go to them. And as I said, over time, I see more and more of those things coming away, and they're just being one board, as part of that whole idea to strip away the red tape and not have two boards to go to, but just one board, and not have two. So,
Just to let you know, we're going to have a quiz on this in 10 minutes.
well,
Thanks, Andy. I know it's a lot. It's a lot to digest.
right. So, we're just trying to build the plane while we're flying it.
Yeah.
Or we're trying to
Yeah.
repair the plane while we're flying it. So,
Great. Okay.
and in the moment, we keep going along with this. And of course, that's coming back to what we were just talking about, the whole idea of a comprehensive review of the zoning and the development review regulations. There's the question of, should we be even doing that while all the state law is in flux? Should we wait until the
Exactly.
state law settles down a little bit before we do something like that?
Wait until July.
So,
So Maria, just again, going through the list
Yep.
of planning priorities, and again, this is from the structure of our budget with town council. So again, we have the regulatory rewrite. We're still supporting boards and commission. We're doing that on an ongoing basis. We're doing development plan and project review. We're still in the process of finalizing the scenic roadway stewardship plan. That's with Beta Group. I wanted to say we're about 60% complete on that, working to wrap that up. We have regulatory changes that we're doing on an ongoing basis. We're missing middle. That project was completed with Horsley Witten. Still kind of could view that as available for implementation phases. We've incorporated the cottage regulations, but not other components of that regulation. We're still in the process of working on our hazardous mitigation plan. We're probably about 25 to 30% complete on that, and should wrap that up in another 4 to 6 months. We have the village studies. Those were completed under the American Rescue Act with our consultant. The next one, again, is the continued evaluation of the zoning ordinance to determine necessary amendments. We talked at nauseam on that tonight. We are looking at the redevelopment of government and institutional zone properties, primarily South County Road, Wakefield Elementary, and the Oliver Watson property in West Kingston. We're about 60% complete on that. We're in the process of scheduling a work session on a separate night of a town council meeting with Union Studio and the town council, as well as staff. The other item we have is the old Tower Hill Road corridor. We're about 90% complete on that. We're kind of in the final draft implementation model phase for zoning regulations. Again, that will probably require a second phase to that and a contract amendment. And then the other things are ongoing day to day. So our big projects as we're coming forward in this calendar year and next fiscal year are really regulatory driven. They're the zoning regulations, they're Old Tower Hill Road, and then finalizing, I would say 3 primary studies being hazard mitigation, scenic byways, and Brian's actually undertaking a work with a consultant with the Historic District Commission on sea level rise and historic properties potentially in risk in Matunic Beach area.
So Jamie, not to negate any of this lengthy list, some of the things in here are planning department, part of the planning department workload, but they're not necessarily things that engage the planning board, like the CRMC SAMP, the HAZMAT plan, things like that. It might be helpful for the board to have a revised work plan of what our focus is going to be, things that we're actively involved with going forward. And again, not to understate any of this other work that's ongoing, but just for us to be able to focus on what we're going to need to do.
Okay. I think a primary component, Maria, if you agree with this, is trying to break down the work on the zoning code and what needs to be completed there and undertaken there. Also as it relates to landscape changes, design standards, and the implementation potentially of the form-based code as a result of the Old Tower Hill Road study. And we can do that.
Okay. Why don't we move on to liaison activities? Joe is not here. I just want to reiterate what Jamie said about the scenic stewardship plan. I hope it's getting beyond the 60%. We have a meeting coming up. My sense from the consultant is that they will be giving us a final version relatively soon. Is that what you? That's our hope. Update from staff? Anything that you haven't mentioned, Jamie, like training opportunities?
Again, I know
I don't know if statewide planning is doing another one. Or,
statewide planning was doing another one. We'll just, again, keep sending that out to you. It was mentioned to me that we didn't get, as individuals, we had registered the members for Rhode Island APA. So we didn't specifically get notified that your membership was up. So Maria you brought that to my attention, so we're in the process of re-upping you as members of the Rhode Island Planning Association. We have some upcoming things. Congress of New Urbanism will be in Providence
That's right.
in
When is that?
mid to late June. I want to say, without looking at a calendar, 3rd week in June.
It's going to be June 1st, June 11th
Huh,
is when it starts.
wow. That's an
June 11th
opportunity for
through
sure,
the
that conference.
14th.
It's a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So, again, one of the opportunities is if you volunteer, you get to either attend, historically, you either get to attend for almost nothing, I don't want to say zero, or $100. So if you have time on your side, we probably have the resources, if you will volunteer a little bit of your time, to cover your 3-day attendance at a reduced rate, if it's in that $100 range. Volunteerism may be you'll help people check in, you may be someone at a table who, knowing the area, who says, you know, I'm from Cincinnati, I came to Providence, if I was here for 3 days or I'm staying the Saturday, where should I go? You know, take a ride to Newport. If you're on the East Coast, go to the Atlantic Ocean. If you're from Cincinnati, you may not have been to the Atlantic Ocean. Take the time and availability to do that while you're here. And again, I can get more specifics. Union
Yes,
Studios
send us the
is
link
involved in
to
that.
the, sure, that would be great.
You know.
It's the weekend of June 11th, and
It-
June 11th is a Wednesday.
It's a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday.
in Providence.
in Providence, at the Biltmore Omni, well, I don't know if it's the Biltmore anymore, but the Omni Hotel.
So in
exchange for volunteering,
you get free attendance?
Free or substantially reduced, so instead of in the $600 to $700 range, it could be in the $50 to $100 range. So again, if you have the opportunity and the time, it is a conference that I try not to miss. Some of you have come in to look at the books that we have. The authors of those books are typically the speakers at the conferences. So if you've attended some APA sessions, sometimes we have, we'll say, peers of Jay, Brian, and I who are very knowledgeable, and some would deem as experts, but typically at CNU you have the experts who taught the experts.
HGC meeting, I know that they have asked for a meeting with us for some time now, hoping that that can be fit into a portion of one of our work sessions.
Again, we'll coordinate with Brian and HTC and potentially see if we can do that in February. If not February, as soon as possible.
Okay.
And I actually have a HDC meeting on Thursday night, so I can certainly talk to them about that.
Great.
And their interest is working on some of the things from the comprehensive plan that are tasked to both committees at the same time.
Great. Conservation Commission letter, recommended changes to landscape code regulations. As everyone knows, we talked a couple months ago about establishing, or we voted to establish a landscaping subcommittee to look at the regulations and make recommendations for changes. We have a local landscape architect who is going to help us with this, very experienced. He has not been available up to this point, but will be available in February. So we'll send something out to folks who volunteered, and as I recall, it was Capers, Susan, myself, and was it Liz or was it Joe? I mean, anyone's welcome. There'll be open meetings. I'll check with Joe. Yes, I recall that. Okay. So, and in advance of that, it probably will be important to review the landscape regulations where they are embedded in our zoning code and in our subdivision regs. And Jay, anything you want to add to that?
There's not much in zoning for landscaping. Zoning pretty much refers you back to the subregs. Landscaping pretty much is tied to parking. Not much else. Just to speak on the advisory that came from Concom back in 2020, they had picked up in the subregs that they wanted to modify the reference to, in regard to the
Natives, right.
potential use of invasive species.
Yeah.
And then in last, I think it was last August, Concom picked the discussion back up again and further clarified that it should be native species. And they also updated the reference to the book on native species that was in the
URI CRMC list?
Yes.
Yeah.
But there was an original book that was referenced, I think it was 1995, that nobody could locate, not even URI, and it was a URI book publication. So we fixed that, hopefully.
Okay. All right, that sounds good.
So can I ask,
So let me just,
Yeah.
so not to be forgotten, since this is an advisory from Concom,
Yep.
kind of out of the blue, I think this should just be noted and kept in the back of our heads for when we do the landscaping.
Right, because that would be
Yeah, just
a
for
normal thing to consider.
just for clarity, just to put that out
Yeah.
there to make sure.
Okay, that's good.
so then Jay, I'll ask you, so if we were to consider looking at the landscape regulations, I think we need to figure out first where it's all referenced in all the different places. So do you have a tight little list of where I would find that, or do I just Google it and it'll pop up? Or how do I find all the different places that refer to our landscaping regulations we have?
You could do what I would do and search the zoning code for landscaping, and then go to the
That's what I do.
subregs and look at specifically the section on landscaping in the subregs is the meat and potatoes of most of it. There may be other references here and there. But if you just simply search the two documents, the zoning ordinance and the subregs for landscaping, and just review the hits that come up.
Right.
Landscape,
'Cause
trees, buffer, there's more than one keyword.
Yeah.
But like I
Some
said,
of
most
the
of it's
special requirements, I think.
most of it's associated with parking lots. I think there's some landscaping requirements. It's non-specific, but for multi-household land development projects. But
And we've talked about the need to have some kind of flexibility with regard to infill-type projects.
Mhm. And I think
And of course, you know our frustrations with things such as buffers and kind of outdated regulations that don't necessarily produce a good end result, or they are either so confusing or not adaptable to certain situations that an applicant will just ask for a complete waiver, and we obviously want to avoid that.
Yeah, and I think it's important as you go through this to be real about, well, what are we really requiring? Is it fair? Is it asking too much of a single property owner to do an extensive multi-$1,000 planting for a small project? There's got to be some thresholds in there, and there's got to be some
Industrial versus,
yeah, and there's got to be some real expectations as to where the value is and what projects get significant requirements and which ones don't.
and how the design and maintenance can affect the long-term investment. Andy, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I just was going to come back to the question about the meetings, and so for the landscape meeting subcommittee, it's being an official subcommittee of the planning board, it should be noticed. And basically, that's the 48-hour notice on the Secretary of State's office, posting of the agenda, and posting the agenda in at least two places. One being town hall, the other being the usual place for posting, which I think is the library. And if you happen to be meeting someplace else than those two, it's got to be posted where you meet. And then just taking minutes, they don't have to be elaborate, verbatim, but who's there as far as members. Just a brief summary of what the points are that were discussed, no verbatim stuff. If any votes are taken, then you would have, who made the motion, who seconded, what was the vote, and what time you adjourned. You have to meet at a place that's publicly accessible. It has to be ADA accessible, and it basically has to be a publicly accessible place. So no meeting in restaurants.
No meeting at the Muse at the bar.
No.
And we'll do our best to provide staff at those meetings.
Right.
You don't, no. You need to have written minutes. You don't need a recording at all. You could have a recording, but that cannot substitute for minutes. You have to have some written minutes with at least the gist of it. Secretary of State's, you file it with the town staff and also the Secretary of State's office.
It'll just say "C recording."
No, that's not okay.
That's written minutes.
No, it's not.
So you use the term Euclidean planning, or
Zoning,
okay.
Euclidean
So do you know
zoning.
why it's called that?
yes.
Euclid versus Ambler Realty, one of the primary U.S. Supreme Court cases.
It was the village of Euclid
That's right.
was the name of the town.
Yeah. Good job, you.
That was a daily double, by the way.
Update on legal issues? signage?
Just, so this is rather straightforward. There was a complaint received by the town from the ACLU. Even though we really haven't enforced our signage languages for a while in the town, we do have language that talks about how that has to be related to an election or a referendum, and you can't put it up more than 60 days before such election, or have it for more than 120 days in any calendar year, or taken out, and all that stuff is not legal. So we've basically drafted an amendment taking those requirements out of the zoning ordinance that were not enforced anyway.
So that means anybody can put up a political sign anytime?
Anytime, and keep
anywhere?
it as long as they want, yes.
Does that have anything to
You're
do
driven
with the
by
public
toilet-
right away?
You're driven by the toilets on East Main Road in Portsmouth? There's someone who has a whole batch of old toilets out in front of his property with signs on them because he has a beef with the town's building officials.
Wow.
Those are political signs. Goes back, there's an old Rhode Island case where some homeowner complained about a smelly sewage treatment pumping station next to him, and he put up a big sign, and the town tried to enforce against it, and they said, no, you can't do it. People have the right to do it, as long as the sign is safe. It can't be a safety hazard that's blocking visibility, or is gonna blow into the road or something like that, and it can't be on public property.
Right.
But
Yeah,
you
yeah.
can say what you want as much as you want.
These are fixed signs to the toilets, or it's just the toilets?
No, there are signs and toilets.
Wow. Well, there were a lot of political signs last year that were in the public right away.
Right, that we can deal with.
Yeah.
We remove them generally.
Yep.
We remove them when we see them. The town tries to deal with it that way. I mean, during election season, I think we try to be realistic. If it's one of these roads where there's like a stone wall, and then technically it's the public right of way, but they've got the sign right outside of their property.
Yeah.
If it's a little bit in the public right of way, we usually don't make a big fuss over it. But when there is, other visible space and it's in the public right of way, or certainly anything that goes on the poles and, stop signs and things like that, we remove, so.
Short-term rentals.
Yes, timing is good on this, although I can't tell you much, I'm sorry. The town council discussed this in executive session last night. I can kind of give you the general gist of it, which is, there was a case in Narragansett which struck down
Yep.
their
Yep.
restrictions. The gist of the case is, well, let me back up. A lot of communities try to regulate short-term rentals outside the zoning ordinance because of the issue of
Right.
pre-existing non-conforming uses. If you do it in the zoning ordinance, you're already stuck with however many you have, perhaps. So, South Kingstown was working on a registration thing. Essentially, the Narragansett case said, registration is business registration. That's left to the state. The cities and towns don't have that power to do it. That's kind of a business licensing without specific authority from the General Assembly. You don't have it. The question, it doesn't look like the General Assembly is going to give it. The General Assembly has said, we've got registration through the Department of Business Regulation now. That's enough. We're not going to do any more. And just for your interest, so how many short-term rental registrations do you think there are in South Kingstown according to the State Department of Business Regulations? This is
For people who have actually done it
people
versus
who
the
have
ones that
registered and
have
said,
not.
I have a short-term rental in South Kingstown. They've registered on the state.
6.
Any other guesses?
None?
523.
People
Really?
Well, it's required by law.
Airbnb makes them, that's right.
It's required. It's not something that's purely voluntary, but it is, yes. So that's a lot when you look at the housing stock.
Yeah.
But, so I think, and I don't know, because the council was discussing it, there isn't any, thing official that's come out of it. but I suspect we will be coming back to trying to regulate it by zoning, and the idea being, even if we can't eliminate all that we have already, at least we can deal with it going forward. And I don't think the goal is to eliminate, but to do it. We actually have, you know, some good language as far as the people living together and requiring special use permits, and I think probably that would be the way to do it, be deciding the zones we want it and have it in special use permits going forward, at least for these short-term rentals.
And didn't the Newport decision basically say that you could, it would have to
You
be
can
contained
regulate
within
them by
zoning,
zoning,
right?
yes,
You just
right.
can't do
Right, right. And-
registration or licensing.
Right, right. And Newport actually, I mean, that they've had for a while, they haven't been allowed in residential zones, even though they were happening. And that's what they cracked down on, and basically said, if you're in a commercial zone, you can do it as of right, business zone, but if you're in a residential zone, you need that special use permit. And yes, that's been upheld. And that's the sort of thing we've done, and, you know, I don't know where we'd come out with the pre-existing non-conforming use stuff on that.
But I thought some of our goal was just to simply get a count.
It is.
And so if you don't
It
make
is.
them pay, can we not have them register
No.
just to get that head count,
No,
even if they don't pay?
no.
Huh.
That's what it appears to say. Now, I mean, it's just a Superior Court decision, and it's just Narragansett, so it technically, doesn't control us, but it's, you know, a well-reasoned decision with a good idea, you know, with the ideas behind it. So, I don't know, maybe we will go ahead and try to register anyway, that was the thought, right, just keep track of what we have. But at least, in light of both the Superior Court saying, town, you don't have the power to register it, and the state sort of preempting the area by saying you register with DBR, even if DBR doesn't go out and enforce it, it's kind of, it's a hard thing to do. I don't think we do have the power to force them to register.
Was there a fee associated with that?
In Narragansett?
Yeah.
I think there was, but I don't think it was a substantial fee.
I think it was like us, I think it was a nominal.
Yeah, I don't think the fee was the issue.
Not a source of revenue then?
Yeah,
right.
it wasn't the fee that was
Okay.
the issue. It was the registration, and that's business licensing, and that's not something granted to the towns.
Andy,
Yes.
is there any chance of this maybe being picked up by Rhode Island Housing? Because every year, we are asked to provide data
That's right.
to the state or to Roger Williams University for Housing Works Rhode Island
One
about
more, yeah.
how many rentals
Right.
we have. And if somebody doesn't have a mechanism to collect the
Yeah.
data,
Yep. I don't know. It's possible. They might. I mean, there are private companies out there that have the software that mine the internet to find them. I mean, the city of Newport does that. They pay a private company to go out and search for the listings and track them down, and then that information, the town then takes to, that's what they use to enforce and send notices of violation and so forth.
we were doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, it can be done that way.
Yeah, didn't we-
for not registering, or the violation for?
If you're operating illegally. But we don't necessarily have them operating, they're operating legally at the moment because we don't control them on the zoning. So that may be a quick fix zoning thing that we do just to at least, you know, at least shut the door to further ones.
Of course, if an applicant came to us and said, oh, we're renting out 3 rooms, and then the Airbnb ad says 8 rooms.
Oh, been there.
Right, well, that's what we try to do. I mean, that's,
Yeah.
you know, that would make sense. And the courts around the country have been all over the place on whether owner occupancy is a valid restriction on these or not. So there's no consensus on whether that's a valid restriction. But, you know, we could try. It's a reasonable one. There's a reason, excuse me, to use the technical term, there's a rational basis for doing it. That owner occupied, the control, and the, you know, if people are living there on the site.
Definitely.
So,
Okay, if there's nothing else, Jamie, do you have some?
We don't need TRC yet, right?
Lynn circulated the planning board meeting schedule, and in her cover note, she said we were going to take a vote to accept it. So,
That's a first.
well, I'm just reading the note.
Yeah, I think, no, it's, generally it's something you're supposed to do. I can't remember if
usually
we've
do
done
it.
it consecutively.
No,
We
It's
have,
given to us and we comply.
yeah. It's a technicality. The board has to just basically approve of your,
Well, Capers, since you brought that up,
well, it's also not on the agenda.
oh,
so-
not on
that's
the
right, it's
agenda.
not on the agenda,
So
so
you
add
can't
it
do
to our next
We'll add
meeting.
it to the regular session.
Okay. Before we adjourn, Jamie, do you want to give us a little preview of what's coming up at our next meeting? If you can?
A lot.
Oh, yay.
Just bear with me. I thought
It's just nice for people to have a heads up, just mentally to, yeah,
Yeah.
how much coffee needs to be consumed and so on. Yeah, yeah.
Speaking of that,
Yeah.
Candy?
sorry, I took a,
While he's looking, can I just, we talked about the joint workshop with the Historic District Commission on February 11th,
Yep.
and is that a definite for the planning board, I guess, subject to the HDC agreeing to it, but that's a definite from your point of view? I mean, I ask because I'm planning on being here for that meeting anyway, and it would make sense to, since I attend the HDC meetings.
Yes.
So I'm
I mean,
happy
I
to be
think
here
we-
for both of it, but I just,
Yeah,
it
I
seemed to
think-
be left in midair, so I'm just
I don't
coming
think it's
back
going to
to it.
take over the work session, but it'll certainly be a portion of that. I don't know how much,
I'm happy to meet with them.
what Brian said sounded really great.
Yeah, so we, at the HDC, we have a sort of a punch list of things in the comprehensive plan that the HDC is implicated in, so I can certainly cull out the ones that are HDC and planning board and
Yeah,
send that around.
that'd be great.
Do they have a full roster now? Are they still really short?
No, we're still really short.
But they can quorum?
Barely.
they need members, Susan, if you know anyone.
Yeah.
I've been drumming up all kinds of people.
Yeah, we're still at 4 members, so
They're still what?
we're at 4 members right now, which is the bare minimum for a quorum.
So, Madam Chair, for our upcoming meeting, you have Old North Road subdivision, you still have...
Fieldstone, you mean, right?
Fieldstone,
Yep.
you have 571 Main Street, you
Yep.
have Kenyon Motion. Those are your probably 3 bigger ones for discussion, and then we have additional fill-in.
Lots on Columbia.
Oh,
3
two pre-apps for.
was one of those the one that didn't show up last time? Yeah.
Mhm. I think there are 4 or 5 lot subdivisions.
Yeah, we don't have the hotel yet, right?
No.
Well, hopefully, the applicants will continue to provide staff with timely information, especially if there are updates to their plans.
I think that's a good point. I think we've started to notice an uptick in applications and the frequency, well, there seem to be more larger applications scattered. I don't know if that's going to be a recurring pattern or not, but I think it's something to keep in mind with the agendas over the next couple months, because the routine continuances are going to come back to bite us if this trend continues and we can't continue to clear the deck
Mhm.
of agenda items. So usually the winter is quiet.
Can I make a formal request, since we have so much homework, that the minute someone drops out, you shoot us an email and tell us we
Yeah,
don't
no,
need
we
to do the
will
homework? Because sometimes we don't find out till we get here, and, it's like cramming before the final exam and then finding out the teacher's not coming. Like, it's good to know.
We will, when we know, we'll try and let you know. To some instances, we find out at the very last minute. I actually had a conversation with one applicant who I tried to impress upon them that You've already tabled your application. We have agendas that need to go out. If you know you're not going to meet our agenda timeframe to push information out, and if you just make our agenda push, that means staff hasn't reviewed your application when the agenda gets pushed. So you may be on the agenda as a subject matter, but that doesn't give staff adequate time to review the revisions you're proposing, so we're kind of walking in cold to that meeting. So if you're just gonna drop a revised set of plans on us with 3 days prep time before a meeting, we'd actually prefer if you potentially ask for an extension, meet with staff in the next 30 days, we'll review your revisions and have you in a better place when you're actually before the planning board. So
That should be
we're
put in
working with
writing
a
somewhere.
couple applicants on that. So, but to Susan, to your point, if we know they're not coming, we'll let you know.
Or-
On planning days, there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get it all in.
Or even revise plans that we are given at the meeting at which we're expected to make a decision.
Yes.
Very frustrating.
Can I also add that, is it 571 Main Street? I'm not sure of the number.
Yes, it is.
That would be the first time that I've ever been sitting in on any discussions about that development, but I do know that it has some history behind it. And I think that probably most of the board is new enough that may
So
not have.
Madam Chair, I don't want to talk about specifics of an application and what
No,
we may
no.
or may not
Are you
want.
talking about
I'm
the
just
ability
saying
to review previous material?
information, like how, I don't think it's appropriate that it's like this brand-new thing that actually has a lot of history behind it. So, do we get sent
Usually
all the
staff comments
previous minutes?
include
Yeah, if you-
summary.
If you
of-
look at that file right now, there's
Yep.
summaries and plan revisions in there.
Particularly if something was subject to an appeal, that would be in a summary that staff would provide.
Yes.
And then one more thing I wanted to ask Andy, can you clarify that if a board member needs to recuse themselves because they live in a neighborhood, that they could still attend that meeting and be a member of the audience? Which I think you said at the statewide planning thing we did?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, you don't have to accuse yourself just because you live in the neighborhood. If you were within the notice radius, you do have to recuse yourself. If you might be outside the notice radius but still affected, then you would recuse yourself if you had thought you had a personal interest. So, but in one of those situations, if you recuse yourself, you certainly can sit and attend and listen and watch. The problem of speaking is there is what they call a public interest exception, that you could still speak as part of the neighborhood, but we definitely advise you to get an advisory opinion from the Ethics Commission. That's what you really should do. If you want to speak as a member of the public about a particular thing that's in your neighborhood, you should get an advisory opinion from the Ethics Commission that says it's okay. And they, my other advice is, if at all possible, don't have someone else come, not you. Spouse, family member, whatever, but not you. You really shouldn't be speaking before your board because of the appearance that presents.
Thank you.
So,
Motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Second?
All right.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.